Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to the fourth part of this semester's exploration of the forest in our natural landscape and human meaning series. Having already thought about some issues, themes in biology, art, philosophy and literature, we now turn to the fascinating topic of the forest's relation to architecture. And to offer their reflections on this theme, we have with us three distinguished faculty members from USD's College of Arts and Sciences. I'll say a quick word about each of them. In the middle, we have Victor Carmona, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and also Director of USD's core curriculum. Dr. Carmona received his PhD in Moral Theology from the University of Notre Dame, and a central element of his research is on theological, ethical questions concerning immigration and the experience of border communities. The aim of Dr. Carmona's work, explored in really an impressively large number of articles, is to draw from the wisdom of the Catholic tradition so as to create more just immigration systems in increasingly pluralistic and interdependent societies. He is president of the Academy of Catholic Hispanic Theologians of the US. At the far end of the table, Satyan Devadoss is the Fletcher Jones Professor of Applied Mathematics here at USD. He graduated as valedictorian from North Central College and received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He taught at the Ohio State University and Williams College before joining USD's faculty in 2016. He's written extensively on the relation of mathematics to the humanities, including pieces in the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times, and is known also for his artworks, including his collection of paintings, significantly enough for us, titled Cartography of Tree Space. And this series has been exhibited in Pasadena and Berlin. A recipient of many teaching awards, Dr. Devadoss is an inaugural fellow of the American Mathematical Society. And our third panelist, Marcel Sanchez-Prieto, received his master's in architecture from UCLA and is associate professor in the Department of Art, Architecture and Art History. He was previously associate professor of architecture and ARCA Social Justice faculty director at the College of Environmental Design, UC Berkeley. Also professor at Woodbury University, and has taught at many other institutions throughout the world, including in Australia, Mexico, China, and Italy. He is co-founder of CRO Studio, a collaborative practice originating in the border region of Tijuana, San Diego, and which explores the relationship between political economic forces, environmental policies, social inequities, and urban development. So this promises, I think, to be an extremely exciting session. So please join me in welcoming Professors Carmona, Devadoss, and Sanchez-Prieto.
Yo soy primero. So I'm the first one, okay. Give me 1 second so I can. That's the one. All right, so can you hear me? Yeah. So anyways, it seems that I should know about architecture in the forest, but I don't. So my work's in architecture and not so much on forest. But I will try to talk about it in the terms of a story, of land story, that is related to the polemics of land and the situation of the San Diego-Tijuana border as a way to understand architectural forest in that term. But the first image that came to mind was this image by Karsten Fodinger, where what is an architectural forest is about negotiating, defining space inside the forest. It's about this situation of how do we administrate land in the forest? How do we create an ecosystem within that space. So, although controversial, right, the concrete and this kind of plinth of what you wanted to create, I think that this is the situation that we're trying always to negotiate the ecological impact of what we do. But I'm going to go back a little bit on telling a little bit of the story that, for instance, wood framing, yes, became a very important element to produce housing, to create affordable housing after the World War II. And definitely until today has been a very predominant way to produce affordable housing. And then I just want to kind of reference that that there was a great exhibition at the Viennese Biennale where Paul Anderson and Paul Preisner created a beautiful installation exhibition of the situation of the origin of the balloon framing, what we call mainly this type of structure, or platform framing that, that started in Chicago and became a predominant element of how to produce housing. So in the production of this housing, it's about how fast and how cheap we can produce this housing in a very extensive way. But nowadays, there's a renewed interest, right, that we see in how could we use wood and become more an ecosystem building, in creating a higher way to create buildings. In this building by Perkins Wills is the first building in San Francisco that is a high-rise in wood structure, applying to code to the California. So this beginning of a future, how we want to produce housing or how we want to produce a denser cities of an ecosystem is what starts to think, how do we relate the production of wood in order to create whole cities in this renewable material? The renewable material that is considered carbon negative in many ways, right? That's what the common conditions that are being kind of talked about within architecture, debatable in many ways also. But the promise of wood, particularly mass timber, is what we can build entire cities using renewable this material, like I was saying before. But it puts into questions how we're going to negotiate or how we're going to harvest this material to create the cities. It's putting a strain into it. So if we think about if forests are optimized only to capture carbon or store carbon as a mass timber, we start creating monocultures of this harvesting. And what are we looking at that future for monocultures of harvesting this material? And what we need to think about is that we need to preserve diversity, biodiversity in these systems. So the challenge remains how to produce biodiversity of mass timber and produce instill end life story, or how to plan buildings to be deconstructed, recycled, and have a second life. So one of the techniques that they're saying is the thinning of the trees or the thinning of the forest to create opportunities to plant and create the material for the new buildings, but also preserve idea of all trees and new kind of conditions of diversity in the forest. Now, that idea of what we're talking about between monocultures and biodiversity, this is where I jump into more understanding the idea of cities and what policies are reconstructed as monocultures in diversity in land. Now, I put this image in the case of the Tijuana watershed, that land management and land policy has been a critical element of how we coexist, always trying to negotiate how we live together in this regard. I'm talking about the relationship of the ecology, radical system that we need to kind of start thinking about to become more sustainable. And as you can see, almost 70 or 80% of the city of Tijuana is inside of the Tijuana watershed. 70 or 80%. And 70, 80% of the Tijuana watershed is in Tijuana. And the discharge, all of it, is in San Diego. So that creates a very complicated dialogue of how we administrate this landscape with different policies and different politics in there. So, but in this river, at the waterbed, right, of what it is, the Tijuana River watershed, and in close connection to the international water, has been a constant dialogue, let's say dialogue, but it's challenging dialogue between inhabiting and controlling it. So there has been a constant negotiation of irregular settlements and the containment of the river. So in many cases, has been a constant battle between civil rights, justice, and illegal development. You need to be close to the center, to the city. This area was the best option, although taking high risk of being flooded and swept away all their belongings or being displaced to the periphery of what was at that time the city. This displacement condition started in the 1940s and it went all the way to the 1970s. So in 1970, what you see here is Cartolandia, even as you can think about the name of it. It was the last settlement in this area that is on the border, the entrance of the watershed. And that's the last settlement that's saying no more irregular settlements. We need to modernize this. We need to contain it. So this is what happens. Many of you know, right? This area of close proximity took one of the most ambitious projects of the time at the national level to resolve the problem of irregular settlements and shortage of housing, driven to have a new image of the country and face also internationally. This was a mandate that came from the center of the country for modernization of the Tijuana River watershed. So a massive concrete channelization that was to contain a 100-year floodplain, almost taking no risk, but taking as much land as possible on the sites for, of course, for the government to sell, to create a more lucrative approach to it. But it also created a very strong thoroughfare along the axis of north-south development of the Tijuana. That became the main arteries on both sides of the channel that connects the whole city in itself. So, in the new condition of the city, new emerging typologies started to emanate along the vertebra of what the city, right, that it was channelized. So this infrastructure creating the great platform for all the emerging typologies that that city had in need for. So that's one of the big transformations that happens in Tijuana in that moment. Now, another very critical moment is this moment in the shift, I would say, from the 1940s all the way to 1990, where the transformation of housing or the idea of providing housing changed many cities in Mexico. So in 1980, it was housing that was provided by the government. At the moment, it was privatized in 1992 by developers. So it created this image of what you see in the left, La Bien Amada, which is a movie in 1951. It's a still image that shows the ambitions of that time of incorporating and providing housing to the masses. What you see in the back is Miguel Aleman's project, the first multi-housing development by Mario Pani. And this was the hope that housing was going to resolve by the project of modernization of architecture. Then until 1990, suddenly there was no way to provide the amount of housing, and it becomes privatized. And the different companies like Geo, Urbi, and all these companies started to kind of fill the market and provide this type of development, a monoculture of development of housing. So that housing, right, that started to create, of course, it became the staple of many cities in Tijuana and cities in Mexico, and of course, Tijuana is no exception. So, what are the implications of a land use policy also that land use or the politics of land use also creates these monoculture conditions? For instance, in the US, what you have in the left is a 2016 map that is a map that calls the smart growth city or the smart growth approach, which is really interesting with what is dumb growth, right? I always like to have these kind of names to it. So then you have the South side always in land banking and kind of hoarding land to provide for informal settlements. So in this notion of the smart growth, the strategy tried to contain the city within the boundaries of the existing structure, creating green belts along the periphery to contain the city, along with NIMBYism, segregation, zoning, among other criteria and forces, has produced a city where land is mainly single family, almost 80 or 90% in the US. Producing a speculation frenzy and a housing shortage that has been so acute that the government has had to intervene to change land policy ordinance to incorporate now like SB 9, SB 10, right, ADUs in order to create these densities. So in Mexico, since 2008, because of the bankruptcy of the main developers of housing, there's almost no production of housing, well, at least in the social spectrum. Mainly has been focused on the middle and high-end residency, particularly mid-rise to high-rise buildings, and also has created a very strained housing market. Speculation of land and high rents has been a big problem. So in this case, what we have is that you have the cost of price, right? A high value, high price in the US, and then 1/3 of the value in Mexico, right? This situation is that what you have, the cost of land, the cost of construction within the city or the perimeter of the city is almost the same, either in Tijuana or in San Diego. But the cost of land, of course, the closer you are to the center, the more cost. But the farther you are from the city, transportation is the big factor. And as you shift also to the Mexican side, it continues to kind of produce that notion of cost of transportation. So in this case, what we see is that more and more Americans are coming to the US as they cannot afford to live in the US. For instance, a house that you can rent in Mexico for $1,000, $1,500, which is a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom house, there's no way you can find a house in that range in the United States. So many people are just shifting and moving like that. So we can say that it's affordable housing through the market, but through the market of the border. Another aspect that what you see here is trying to map the different mechanisms and process that a person goes through in order to get a loan or access to affordable housing. This diagram needs to be updated, but it has helped me to reveal the main sources of housing production and the main architectural element that dominates the urban fabric, in this case what we're calling the architectural forest. In the US, it's still within the spectrum of private entities. Mexico is still in informal settlements as a main generator. So in 1976, this English architect, John F. Turner, published the book Housing by the People Towards Autonomy in Building Environments, based on the formative years he spent in the settlements of Peru. In the central thesis was that the housing needed to be built and managed by people themselves. Turner criticized anti-squatter governments, arguing that self-building would be the more efficient and beneficial way to create housing than the government. Well, I think he will be happy to know that this still is the case of the majority of the cities in Latin America, in Tijuana, of course, which at point or another started to be irregular. So, for instance, Tijuana, 60 to 70% of the city of Tijuana at one point or another started as an irregular settlement. Imagine that, only 30% or 20% is what's really planned. So in this case, when the fabric of the city, right, has been generated in this form and slowly regularized, what is happening now is that a lot of developers are doing what we call land banking of land hoarding at the periphery of the city. And this land banking, land hoarding, is about how to kind of speculate on the periphery and then saying, well, you can come and settle in this land. There's no infrastructure. There's no service at all. But I can create private contract with you. And this is the fastest way I can flip a land. So the return on investment is minimal. But here you're saying you can settle after a few amount of people come into the land, then say, well, government is your problem. Bring infrastructure in. That has become a very powerful system of creating housing in the most efficient, I would say. So what we end up is a city marked by the modernization of the 1970s. The Channels rivers dissected the city in east-west. It's accentuated affluent and non-affluent. Now this space of a Channels River in a clearly defined space of jurisdiction and control between federal government, state, municipality has again witnessed settlements. At one point, irregular settlements called ñongos. They were settling inside the Channels River. So the expansion also, a large swath of housing at the periphery generated from the shift in the 1990s to house as many as people possible the fastest way, and where the biggest example is the one in Valle de las Palmas, which is like 35 minutes from the center of the city. And they were trying to allocate 1 million people, a city designed for 1 million people. Of course, it's still there. It's forgotten in many ways. There's a university right now, one state university, but if you go there, it's totally abandoned. 1 million never happened. So the last one is how we're constructing this relationship of speculation of land and that shifting the unaffordability of people in the US, and then how they're transforming our fabric in Mexico and creating a trickling down condition where people in Mexico, they cannot compete with the US dollar, and so now they're even more and more pushed away to the periphery. So it's not to put a very green kind of aspect to this kind of situation, but it's in order to kind of understand that this is our architectural forest. This is a condition that is in need of a biodiversity, it's a need of overriding monocultures, and in the need of a more sustainable shared ecosystem that we need to consider in these both sides of the border, or the line that divides this space. Anyways, that's what I'm going to end up with that moment there.
Okay, so hopefully this works. Yay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Muy bien, buenas tardes. Good afternoon. So in my talk, I'm gonna focus on this question of glimpses of deep reality. When I heard about this topic, I was really intrigued because of some experiences that I had right before I began college. So I'm going to be dividing my time into these 3 moments. So first, looking up and looking in through verdant green. I'm gonna, just share a brief experience with you in terms of what had me thinking through these questions. Then I'm gonna move on to forest and cathedrals in the medieval Christian imagination. And then finally, just pointing to some reflections based on what we're gonna be listening. So inviting humility and empathy among us here at USD. Now, words to the wise. I'm definitely not an architect, and I'm not a medievalist. When I look into medieval history, I do so because I'm curious to try and understand the worldview that produces some of their ideas and insights. Also, word of warning: these are ideas that I'm still exploring and I'm curious about because I care deeply about this question of compassion, including in the context of the immigration debate. Now, what you're seeing on the screen, this is pretty much the thesis statement or argument that I want to share with you. This is what I'm always going to be pointing to. So there's something to the ways in which medieval Christianity thought of forests and trees that I find very intriguing. They seem to have used forests and trees as models of a reality that seems to escape our grasp. They call for humility and awe, and frankly, a wonder at the mystery of who we are in relationship to God, to each other, and frankly, to ourselves as well. So I'm really intrigued by this, and this is what I want to be sharing with you today. So first of all, then, looking up and looking in through verdant green. Right before college, I decided that I wanted to repeat. I know this sounds insane now, but I wanted to repeat my last year of high school in French. I wanted to learn French. I wanted to go to a different part of the world. And frankly, I was intrigued by Belgium, not only because I like beer and I love chocolate, but also because it's a different borderlands. And at the time, the European Union was just starting, and I was really intrigued by this process. And I was curious about international relations. Now, what you're seeing here is a park that was near the house where I lived, with a religious group, the Salesians. And I remember just being captivated by this little street there, this part of the park, because growing up in the desert, for me coming to San Diego to visit my grandparents, I remember I thought San Diego was like the greenest place on the planet. I thought, oh my God, it's so green. But then when I went to Brussels, it just like, boom. So for me, that first spring was just sheer magic. I had never seen such greens. So I remember walking through this calm, just gazing up, and it was just like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. And just being enthralled by this vision. And then I saw this. So this is one of the churches that I would visit. This is actually the cathedral in Brussels, la Cathédrale de Saint-Michel-Gudule. And as you're kind of like going the corner there, I remember just like, oh my God, this looks just like the trees outside. And what I started learning and realizing was that, at least in the imagination of Catholics in Belgium, this was no accident. Cathedrals and churches, particularly of the Gothic style, were meant to evoke the experience that I had while walking. So when I heard about this series on the forest, I'm like, ooh, maybe there's a bit of time to, cook something up and share it. So moving on to the second point then, forests and cathedrals in the medieval Christian imagination. That experience, I wanted to explore a bit more of what that meant. And here, I want to share with you that I turned to this medieval historian, Mark Bloch, and this is what he writes. So this is from his book, Feudal Society, and it's a chapter on modes of feeling and thought. And he titles it, The Person's Attitude to Nature and Time. So he writes, the people of the two feudal ages were close to nature, much closer than we are. And nature, as they knew it, was much less tamed and softened than we see it today. The rural landscape, of which the waste formed so large a part, bore fewer traces of human influence. The wild animals that now only haunt our nursery tales, bears and above all wolves, prowled in the everyday wilderness and even amongst the cultivated fields. So much was this the case that the sport of hunting was indispensable for ordinary security, and almost equally so as a method of supplementing the food supply. So the forest was this place that you respected. It was a space where you didn't really have a sense of surety. I mean, you kind of expected what to find, but at the same time, it's not the forest as I shared with you in that image. It's not paved. It's not something easy. Now, what also intrigues me is that in that medieval Christian society, there was this sense of an appreciation for the importance of spiritual organizations like cathedrals, and precisely insofar as that they were spiritual. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. In their imagination, in their worldview, there was this notion of a terrestrial world that was completely imbued with supernatural significance. And it's a way of seeing the world that I think is still very much alive in Iberian cultures and in cultures that, also are coming from France, including the Quebecers. So this is something that just really intrigues me. Now, moving from forest, from the big picture to the trees, I also found something quite intriguing. I found some research by scholars of spirituality and theology that explore this very interesting practice that developed among religious women in the Middle Ages, where they would embrace trees, like actual trees. They would embrace the trees as part of their spiritual exercises to think about and imagine and better understand their vocation and their discipleship. And I was just really intrigued by this practice. So one of the scholars, Sarah Richley, focuses on this concept of spiritual arborescence. And what she writes about is, this approach to trees that they relied on to sustain their understanding of their devotion, not just to be in proper relationship with each other as a community of women religious, but also in terms of modeling their own relationship with Christ. So here, for example, this scholar finds that in the Middle Ages, women religious in particular developed these practices around an understanding of the tree of incarnation, so the tree of Jesse. And here the idea was that they were looking for a sense of mutual indwelling in God that made Christ real through their community by living in community. Very intriguing ideas, and I can share more during the conversation if need be. And then she also finds evidence of a particular approach, particularly later on in the Middle Ages, to the tree of crucifixion, and this idea of a personal dwelling in God that allows the self to conform to holy matter. I found that very, very intriguing. So the tree of incarnation and the tree of crucifixion serve as models of a supernatural reality that they can somehow access by encountering trees and seeing in a tree that they would, any tree that they would embrace, they would imagine that tree as a tree where the cross of Christ actually came from, or imagining that tree as the actual tree of incarnation. Very interesting stuff there. And this takes me to another very interesting figure, and here again, I'm not a medievalist, I am not an expert on Hildegard of Bingen, but in my feminist theology class, I found her to be one of the most captivating and interesting, scholars of the Middle Ages. And here, I'd like you to point to this article by Nathaniel Campbell, who describes the concept of viriditas, viridity. Very intriguing concept. It's a concept that I'm still trying to more fully understand. It's a concept that Hildegard ascribed to the Holy Spirit to denote God's creative fertility. And I love this, the maternal goodness of God that gives birth to and nurtures the whole world. Now, what's interesting about the way that Hildegard seems to have thought about trees and greenery and all these things in her life is that she saw a relationship between veridity, viriditas, in the actual physical world and in an analogous way among society. So she argued, that when humans are spiritually virtuous and verdant, this is reflected in the physical world by verdant balance. And by contrast, when humans are spiritually sinful and arid, then the physical world is thrown into chaos as a result. Now, this is Nathaniel's words. Nathaniel goes on to argue that from the context of the medieval imagination, this is why we should care about environmental justice. Failures in environmental justice, forests that are dying, and so on, speak to a failure or to a weakness in terms of our viriditas as a society, a lack of the presence of grace, which I just find very, very intriguing and frankly, just challenging. So then moving on from forests to trees to viriditas, now to the Gothic cathedrals. So here, I turn to the research of colleagues who focus on architecture and liturgy, particularly in terms of the question of how do churches reflect this understanding of reality that escapes the material world. And here, I want to point to this quote. So Gothic churches in the medieval imagination came to be seen as symbolic analogs of the heavenly city itself. By the 12th century, monumental and awe-inspiring great churches were widely viewed as metames of heaven. So just as trees have the ability and forests have the ability to be metames of heaven, so do cathedrals by precisely evoking this sense of awe by looking up and wandering to the canopies of the trees and the light beyond. So here I'm going to read this quote fully because I just find it very intriguing and helpful to our conversation. So Kilder writes, architectural historians William Anderson and Clive Hicks hold that the interior space of the Gothic great church, with its complex patterns of aisles, transepts, ambulatories, and apses, all defined by towering shafts into webbed vaults, constituted a built equivalent of a forest. Unlike the easily understood spaces of the Byzantine Church, which made the great power of the emperor and clergy transparent, the complex Gothic spaces required the faithful to peer into and search through them, replicating the need to search through the awe-inspiring mysteries of the medieval Eucharist service for an understanding of the divine. Within the medieval space, the worshiper became an active, if somewhat frustrated seeker, and the architecture itself helped to naturalize the alignment of the clergy with the object of the search, divine supernatural power. So these are some photos from a visit that my family and I did 2 years ago to, the forest up north of San Francisco, Muir Woods, yeah. So when we were walking through Muir Woods, we came across this patch of Muir Woods that was called the Forest Chapel or something like that. And I was really intrigued again by that. And again, you see I thought that was such a great name for that, the chapel. Just because you can't, again, you're looking up. And again, it's evoking some of the experiences that I had when I was younger. This is, for example, a picture of Notre Dame de Paris before it burned down. This is a picture that I took at the la Catedral de la Santa Cruz y Santa Eulalia in Barcelona. Notice again the Gothic, now again in a Spanish style here. This is another picture from La Catedral del Mar, Santa Maria del Mar, which inspired a novel. Again, neo-Gothic, a bit younger than the previous one. Again, you see that columns just jutting up. Columns that kind of like the canopy up there. One of my favorites here, Westminster Abbey in London. Again, Gothic. Here you see it in spade. Kind of like the trees, just in the canopies going down there. The light playing with the viewer as well there. And now here a neo-Gothic cathedral. This is the Basilica de la Sagrada Familia that started in the 1880s. And it just, again, it blew my mind. I mean, it's by far one of my favorite cathedrals in the world. You see, again, the echoes of the forests in here. And just the way that the architect here plays with light is just sheer beauty. We went during a golden hour, and here you see the sun. The sun was setting, and then suddenly just all these colors of the rainbow appeared in a way that, again, you just drew awe from everybody who was there. It was just a beautiful, and this is where the insight of the medieval, Christians was very interesting. It was a beautiful, communal, and yet at the same time individualistic experience. They had this ability to marry the two in ways that I think we need to be attentive to. Here, this is a picture of a model of the trees, of a tree that for the architect is an analog of the order of reality as he understands it. So finally then, inviting to humility and empathy among us. So in these last 3 minutes, I just want to share with you some of my initial reactions to the work of a theologian, scholar of spirituality as well, who I just came across recently, Michelle Saracino. She wrote this beautiful piece in Spiritus magazine titled Intimate Wilderness, a Spirituality of Empathy. And here what she argues is that wilderness and forest as well, but particularly wilderness in her case, including forests, can serve as analogs to help us think through the need for empathy. And they can help us as analogs to think through the kind of humility that empathy requires from among us. So here, I'm going to just quote a full paragraph from her work. So she writes, demonstrating intellectual humility requires admitting that one does not know everything about the natural world or the other in one's midst. As a result, enacting intellectual humility demands a sensitive approach to the wild, with a willingness and a commitment to learn. Realizing this and embracing that in the interpersonal wild has the potential for developing more robust, more empathetic relationships. And here, she goes on to argue and to suggest that being in the wilderness of being in relationship with others requires a kind of, calls for a kind of awe and admiration and respect of the mystery of who we are, not just as a community, but also when we are in relationship with others. It calls for the kind of respect that the medieval Christian imagination had whenever it went into the forest. So whenever we're in this kind of like forest of relationships here among us at USD, for me, it's this interesting suggestion of awe and respect for each other, because that awe and respect for each other, just like in a forest, might call forth from us empathy and just respect at the mystery of who we are, not just as a community, but also with each other and even with ourselves. And perhaps out of that empathetic relationship, we will also nurture the viriditas that Hildegard invites us to experience. And with that, thank you for your time.
Thinking, it's almost 5. There's nothing better than to end the day with a math lecture. Get on. Those who want to leave, now's a good time. No apology needed. Thank you. I'm excited for this. It's just interesting, just this panel of how we started in a very grounded world. And actually we're building things with dirt and wood. And then we move into a little bit more of the experience of something bigger than who we are, using those things, kind of pointing to some, bigger notions of God and these ideas of grandeur. And now we've just left everything. So I want to leave it with this one sentence. To me, my definition, as a mathematician, we're just obsessed with definitions. And my definition of what a forest is simply the second sentence. It's just a space of trees. So if you take a bunch of numbers like 1, 3, 854, -7, pi, any number you can think of, right? Take it all together, you can build an entire space out of it. It's not just a bag of numbers, but you can build a space out of it. That's what we call the number line. So you can actually visualize every number imaginable in like this one visual space. And what I want to do is to visualize trees as mathematicians would. So the most important definition to me is what a tree is, and I'm motivated by this. So this is a tree from Darwin's notebook as he's thinking about how trees are related genetically. Right? Is it possible that these species of A, B, C, D, and 1, this is kind of his first scribbling of these genetic trees can make sense? And what I want to do is build an entire space out of these ideas. So let me tell you a couple of tree structures. So here's one. This is what we could think of as an evolutionary tree. How Ron and others can correct me if I'm wrong here, but this is one sample of where things could be. But here we are, woo, animals. Next to fungi and slime molds, at least from where we thought we were in the evolutionary pattern. You have things like ethnic trees. So like I am not just Indian, but I'm Dravidian, which is like on the south side of India, right? So like here. So that's like in the ethnic world of all things, and you can kind of find out where your world is. And these are all, of course, guesses, right? Because we were going back in space and time and trying to figure out things. So best shot, and this is a tree that keeps track of information. There's even a book by David Byrne, which he just has a whole book on trees. He just has drawings and drawings and drawings of trees. And this particular one is about how music is related in his mind. Like rock and urban are sort of related to death hop, but a power hair is in a different category to him, right? I don't know what those words mean, but he has a book on it. To him, there's a tree structure on how these objects are related to one another. And to me, this notion of a tree is just a way of capturing data that's more complicated than just ordering things. Cool? If you have 7 things and you know this one is less than this, but this one's bigger than this, you can just order it directly. But what if it's more complicated than a direct ordering system? You can create a tree structure where there is partial ordering. Like you can kind of see like power hair is related to hard cheese over here, right? But that you can't really order that with swing and emo. That's in a different world. So it's a way of putting an ordering, but not a complete ordering. So that's how the usefulness of mathematics might play a role here. Okay, this is my favorite paper I've ever read in my life. It's my favorite paper. So let me just show you. This paper is written by 2 faculty in Cambridge from the Department of Biochemistry, a professor in the Humanities Research Institute in Sheffield, and a faculty in the Division of Learning Development, which I don't know what that is in Leicester. And so this paper is the Phylogeny of the Canterbury Tales. So it turns out there are about 66 extant manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales. We have actual copies of them, and the problem is nobody knows which one is closest to Chaucer's original work. Right? They're all around, so who copied off of who, as these are all different from one another, right? You can't do like DNA analysis, you can't do, carbon dating. These are all crude techniques that can't get to the finesse of how these things are related. So here's what they did. They took the copies of the manuscript and they literally typed them out, like, the boy went to the store. They actually took the Wife of Bat's prologue as the main one to do. The boy went to the store, and they just took literally the words, the letters as the pieces of DNA. And they put it into a gene sequencing machine, and it spit out this tree. This is how the 66 manuscripts of the Wife of Bat's prologue that we currently have in existence are actually related to one another. And it's not linearly related, right? It's not like A is less than B is less than C, but you can kind of see it's color-coded. They color-coded this, and you can see that there's some kind of a error that happened, and these are all copies of one another in some sense, right? That's why they're related to one another genetically based on the words. And you can see this grouping, the black one, is in a different world, right? They kind of have a different set of errors and propagations. And so there's this kind of classification of how it is, and what they noticed is what scholars actually found interesting and what they currently believe Chaucer's work is actually not what they find, which is the center of all the street turns out to be the red ones. All the objects that happen to be the red-colored ones are sort of in the middle of all of this. So there's a claim that you could make that that's probably closest to Chaucer's original work, where these other airs were propagated from it. On the other hand, you could also make the claim that this one's Chaucer's original work, and everybody else has messed up a lot from that one, right? But it's just a step towards a conversation. And I love the fact that you can be playful in these ideas. They're not making a distinctive claim that this notion of fake genetic analysis is anything other than a part of the bigger story. Okay, so here's what I want to do today. That's just the setup of the dumbness of mathematics. You see, life is so complicated in terms of biological issues, in terms of architectural issues, what it means to be human, what it means to talk about the divine. And mathematicians deal with the stupidest things. Just in the most base scenario, we have things like formulas and equations. I mean, it's so pathetic that we can actually have a form. You saw no formulas before, right? It's so complicated, there's no formula to talk about what it means to deal with the divine, but ours is so simple, we can do this thing. So let me show you how mathematicians think of trees. It's not about the usefulness of deep genetic research or even David Byrne's work about rock and pop hair. It's just symbolic things like this. So here's my notion that I'd like to talk about. So imagine you have 3 creatures, 1, 2, and 3. And these could be your brothers and sisters, your cousins, the closest family members you can imagine, students in a class, whatever you want it to be. And you can't tell the difference between them. I have a student here, so let's pretend I don't. But if you walk into a class, they all look the same, right? And it's there I am, and count 3, and so there's 1, 2, 3. You really can't tell. And so that, to me, is a notion of a kind of tree where you cannot actually parse the information between them. But what you could do is you could actually imagine that this is 1 and 2 are actually brothers and sisters, and this is your cousin 3. And so you can kind of imagine, literally, and you can actually think of this, pulling 1 and 2 by the hair and kind of pulling it out and stretching it. Okay? And as you stretch it, you can see this is a different tree. It gives you different information than this one does. Right? This is basically saying you can't tell the difference. And now what you're seeing is actually 1 and 2 are in a different category than 3. Cool? Great. But what's more interesting to me is this little thing colored red, which means the length of how much you pull it tell you how far away 1 and 2 is from 3. So the longer you pull, the farther that genetic data is from 3. Right? So the longer you pull 1 and 2 away from 3, it tells you that 1 and 2 are more and more unrelated to 3 than there is. And so let's call this distance x, whatever number, letter, symbolic notion you want to call that distance. You could see that that distance could be really small. It could be like a distance of a half. And if it's a half, you're right here. And if that distance is the distance of 3, that means you're right here. And if that distance is like distance of 17, you're over here. And you can make that distance as big as you want to, so you're going to end up somewhere on this line. Does that make sense, my friends? And you can actually shrink that distance down till it's 0, right? And then if you do, then you're back to this point. Right? You've shrunk it all the way down, so 1 and 2 and 3 are all the same creatures. Okay, so you can actually, now notice the 1, 2, 3, that distance can never be negative, right? That doesn't make any sense. You can be 0, and then you can keep stretching it as much as you want to. So you're here, and you could stretch this distance and make it as long as you want to. Great. Here's another thing you could do. Instead of pulling 1 and 2 and pulling it away, you could have actually pulled 1 and 3 in the exact same way, right? Because 1 and 3, that's a different relationship than 1 and 2. In fact, the other thing you could have done is you could have pulled 2 and 3 away. And if you think about this for a second, that's all you could have done. Any way you could draw a tree structure with these 3 creatures has to be somewhere on this picture, on this screen. Cool? Like, how can we pull it? We can pull 1 and 2, we can pull 2 and 3, and I can pull 1 and 3. Victor, does that make sense? You happy? And I can pull it really long. In fact, I can pull it almost infinitely long. So these things don't end at the screen. They just go on infinitely forever. They're actually 3 rays that are centered at a point and go out. And what you're looking at is what I would call a mathematical forest. Because every point on the screen that's colored is a different tree. And I'm actually organizing all the trees ever imaginable in 3 species into this thing on the board. Cool? Just like you can organize every number you could imagine on a number line, I'm organizing all the things of 3 different species onto this board. And it's actually geometric, Nolan, to make you happy, not topological, which means you can actually measure distances. So for example, if Victor, you have a tree right here, And Noel, you have a tree over here. You could actually find the average between these trees. You take the length between it and find the midpoint, and that's the average. So you can start averaging trees. You can find the midpoint of several things. You could do a lot of crazy analysis and statistics on this space. Just like we take the number line and we could subtract two numbers, right? That's a way of measuring distance between them. You could average numbers. Okay, cool so far? Now things get weird, as they should. Because now it's great, it's lovely to have 3 things, but I'd like to be a little more complicated. So what happens if you have 4 things? And all I'm going to do is talk about this, right? So the rest of this, about 8 minutes to 10 minutes is just to explain this 4 little hairy things. You have 1, 2, 3, 4. They're all related to one another. You can't tell the difference between them, so there you are. Right? It doesn't matter if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 1, 2, 4, 4, 1, 2, 3. They're all brothers and sisters, right? You can't really tell. So there's only one possible choice you have. But now I can grab and start pulling things just like the way I did before to create different structures between them. So one thing I could do is I can grab 1, 2, and 3, all 3 of them, and pull it. Cool? And so this is 1, 2, 3 that's unrelated to 4. And this little green length tells you how far they are unrelated to the 4th one. And notice this actually goes infinitely long. That's totally true. But I'm actually restricting it so I can just draw the thing on the screen. That's the only reason, right? So let's pretend that most you could pull it is like 1. It doesn't matter, right? But just so I can draw the picture. So this is one thing I can do. But notice there's something else I can do, right? You can also take 1, 2, 3, 4, but I could have just pulled 1 and 2 instead of pulling 1, 2, and 3. So if I just pulled 1 and 2, you notice that there's another whole spectrum of possibility that I could have done. In fact, you could actually do both. If you do both, you have this 2-dimensional possible thing. You could both pull the 1, 2, 3, and at the same time, you could also pull the 1 and 2. In fact, you could put 2 of them at the same time. That means this variable is keeping track of this height, and this variable is keeping track of this width. So those 2 numbers are giving you a 2-dimensional space. Y'all remember like x, y coordinate system, right? Or x is something and y is something, that point? To me, it's exactly the same thing, where x is keeping track of the, right? It's keeping track of the red information, and y is keeping track of the green information. Cool, that's great. And notice that this is actually not a square, it's actually a quarter of the plane, right? Because I can pull that as long as I want to. So take a plane, take a quarter of it, it's a quadrant. But I'm just drawing it visually like this thing. Just like that ray was a half of a line. This is a quarter of a plane. It's basically the positive part, right? Because I don't want to do negatives. Okay, that looks pretty, but the catch is that this is one silly way I could have taken these 4 species. But I could also do this. You notice that instead of taking 1, 2, 3, 4 and pulling it this way to 1, 2, 3, and 4, I could have pulled it so 2 and 3 were here, and then 1 is here. I could have pulled it that 1 and 3 are here, and 2 is here. In fact, do you guys see this trivalent fin? That is exactly because we saw that trivalentness in the picture before. Somehow the 3 species has somehow to be related to the 4 species, right? One is related in a subset of the other one. So you see this trivalentness going on. So you have trivalent quadrants that go infinitely big. Okay, great. Something weirder happens. In fact, if I look at this picture, and this is where I get turned on, right? So you have these pictures snapping together, and you somehow have like a pentagon floating behind the scene. Now this, I don't understand, like where did the pentagon come from? It turns out that if I look at this structure here, notice that 1 and 2 are here and 3 is here, I can shrink this thing down, and I can just pull the 3 and the 4, and I'll get this picture. So me shrinking this edge down is like me walking down here, and pulling the 3 and the 4 is me landing in this chamber. And me shrinking and landing means moving in this chamber. Me shrinking, so I can actually move, shrink, and land, and walk all the way in this pentagonal movement without actually ever getting to the center. So, wait. Last time I had 3 fins that locked together, and now I've shown you something with a triple fin and a pentagon. Like, how many things are there that I'm actually dealing with that I have to snap together like a Lego set? There turns out to be 15 of them. So instead of the 3 and then the 5, it turns out in reality you have 15 quadrants. Take a plane, take a quarter of it, take 15 of them, and I need to glue them together. And when you glue them together, this is the generalization of how many there has to be. We'll talk about that later. When you glue them together, this is what you get. Now let me just show you what this is in a second, right? What this is really, I love Victor's look, which is what? I love that tilt because it's important. Do you guys see one of these pieces? This is actually one of those squares that I drew before, kind of squished, so I can actually draw it visually. This is actually an infinite quadrant that goes on forever. So this kind of flower-looking thing are 15 different things glued together and snapped together that way. And how do they glue together? Well, first of all, notice, do you guys see that these flowers kind of look like pentagonal flowers? That's because we saw that pentagonal relationship before. That's number one. Number two, notice that 3 pentagonal flowers like meet along one of those fins. Right here, there's like the green one and the blue one and the red one kind of meeting there. That's that trivalentness in this structure. And moreover, this is not done. You don't have these little dangly things left over. Actually, what you need to do is you need to glue this thing and glue it to this. And then you actually need to glue this thing and glue it to this edge. And then you need to take that thing and glue it here. The only way you can actually do that is you need 4 dimensions to do it. But that's okay. I mean, that's just a visual thing. But still, this thing exists. And the reason I call it 2 dimensions is it's just a bunch of 2D flat things you're gluing. So at the end of the day, it's just 2-dimensional stuff. You need 4 dimensions to glue. And this is the space of 4 species. No matter how you take any 4 species in the history of the world and how you want to relate them, whatever the species could be, 4 students, 4 your family members, 4 shoes that you have, and how to relate one another, anything you could ever imagine is somewhere in this world. Just like any number you could imagine is somewhere in the real number line. Okay, so we have those things. And as mathematicians, if you're staring at this for a second, you realize something. What's really interesting is not the flower or the dot, but there's some shape that is being kind of like, there's a cone. Can you guys feel like this kind of cone structure? What is that thing that you're doing the cone over? And so that thing turns out to be this. So it turns out this is the entire money that's keeping track of this. So if I take a point and draw a line from this point to every point here and go through it, you get to rebuild this thing. Another way of thinking, if I take a knife and I slice this right here, what you would see at the very tip is you would see this picture. Now let's look at this for a second. Can you guys see at every point there's a trivalentness at every point? That means because 3 things are meeting at that one point. Can you see there's some pentagons floating around, right, if you kind of stare at this thing? But in a funny way, you also see like these weird hexagons floating around too. So what's going on here? Turns out to be 12 pentagons. Remember, so there's some pentagons. This is where it's really appearing, that weird pentagon, but I noticed there are 12 of them. And some hexagons they're noticing, there are 10 of them. Okay, so that has this funny structure. That's interesting. What happens if I just kind of move it to a little higher dimension? Remember, we just talked about 2D things. Now I need to glue a bunch of 3D things. Remember how I got 15? That 15 is 3. Remember how we got 3 in the beginning, the trivalent. You multiply it by 5. 3 times 5 is 15. Then you multiply by 7. So 3 times 5 times 7. I'm just multiplying odd numbers. 3 times 5. So 7 times 5 times 3 is 105. So I take 105 3D chambers in 3-dimensional space and I glue them together. And you're going to get something, and Victor, I'm not going to show you what that is.
Oh,
I know.
is it going to fit?
It won't. But it's like, now you can see like, oh my gosh, I'm tasting the mind of God. It's amazing. Mathematics is gorgeous, isn't it? All right, so this is what you end up with is some of the pieces of the puzzle. Remember how we had pentagons last time? And I said I had a handful of them? It turns out you get this structure, the most beautiful structure there is. And you get 60 of them. It's called the dodecahedron. Then you also get this structure. Remember how we got the hexagons? This is the hexagon analogy. And it turns out you have 15 of them. And if you put all of these things together, you get some structure like this. And now what this is this the one-dimensional skeleton of it. So it's not all the 3D things, it's not all the 2D things, it's the skeleton that holds it. And there's this funny coloring that I have. And what that coloring is this. So it turns out all the vertices and edges and faces, remember how I told you that's how you can pull the trees apart? Within a tree, you can start classifying different kinds of trees. So it turns out not only are there tree structures, but there are different kinds of tree structures. You can color them. And the question about what is really going on here is absolutely unsolved. So I can tell you that number, the 12 and the 60, and I could generalize that thing, and I could tell you a rough idea of the tree structure, but what is this overall pattern? Unknown. So I was working, and I think I just want to close with this notion that Brian came up, that introduced me with, which is, I was working at Berkeley for a year, and I met an artist there, and I was asking him, can we think about some unsolved problems together? And we ended up thinking about this problem together. So we wrote an article, but more importantly, we came up with, and my artist is from his own shoe, we came up with a triptych of paintings, and this is his interpretation of our work, which is what does the one skeleton of this complicated world look like? So this is what happens if you lived in that world as an underground system. He called it cartography of tree space. This is what happens if you actually look at it from a road network that Marcel was talking about, the roads in. in Tijuana. And then there's a third triptych that I don't want to show you, which is what it looks like from space. So that's our adventure, just a little taste of tree space from mathematical world. Thank you so much.